Hello. Hello all. Good afternoon. Thanks for waiting. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Kevin Siena. I'm a professor of history at Trent University in Peterborough. And on behalf of my colleagues, who you'll meet in a few minutes, I'd like to welcome you to the second presentation in the Pandemic Histories series of virtual seminars. This series is sponsored by the Canadian Society for the History of Medicine, to which we are, of course, grateful. I'd like to give specific thanks to Assult Jones, who helped spearhead this initiative for the series and who helped organize this particular session. And I'd also like to thank Anya Moody Foster of the Manitoba Museum, who's helping organize the tech. And thanks, of course, to all of you who are joining our conversation today. We are all separated, but we're finding ways to come together. And while we are together today in this virtual space, it's important to remember that, of course, we all inhabit physical spaces. We live and work and play in real places. And so I would like to start by respectfully acknowledging the place that I inhabit. I'm speaking to you today from the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. I've lived and worked here since 2001, so almost 20 years, and it's been my honor and my considerable privilege to be able to do so. So I would like to offer my gratitude to the First Peoples of this land for their care for and their teachings about our land, our earth, and our relations. May we all honor those teachings. So a few words on the format of today's talk. I hope that many of you joined 2 weeks ago for the terrific conversation, the first seminar on 1918 flu pandemic and its lessons for today. We'll follow the same basic format. There will be roughly 10-minute presentations by each of 4 presenters, followed by a Q&A. And this is where all of you will come into it. There is a chat function if you look at the bottom of your Zoom. So audience members are indeed invited and encouraged to send us questions and comments as you would if this were an in-person conference. We will be able to monitor the chat throughout the talk, and we have the help of graduate student Chris Colesso, who's going to be helping us in that regard. Now, in the last seminar, the scholars kind of had a conversation between one another after their presentations, as they reflected on one another's presentations before moving to the Q&A. But as there are 4 of us, we didn't want things to run on too long, so we're going to move right into the Q&A. So the title of our seminar today is On the Margins, Epidemics and the Disenfranchised. We'll be exploring how past epidemics have impacted the socially vulnerable, the marginalized, the poor, the politically disenfranchised. And I want to say at the start that we're defining marginalization fairly broadly. There are lots of factors that can be at work to situate people at the social, economic, or cultural margins, and we won't be able to discuss them all, obviously. So these will be more like select case studies rather than an attempt at comprehensive coverage. But it seemed like a vital theme to explore because it is very much pertinent today. When COVID spread globally in March, it did so at a blistering pace. No country was spared by about March 15th or so. And this may have created the sense that COVID was democratic. Everyone was at risk. We were all in this together. But as COVID revealed itself, we found that it was not striking democratically. It soon emerged that rates of both morbidity and mortality were powerfully driven by factors like age, as was well known early on, but also, as any epidemiologist would have predicted, by things like class, race, ethnicity, immigration status. And this reality is being borne out in the United States, in Canada, in Britain, just about everywhere one looks. So we can consider just a few quick examples in the United States. Black Americans are dying of COVID at a rate roughly 2.5 times that of their white countrymen. The New York Times reported recently that in some states, including Michigan, Kansas, Wisconsin, and in cities like Washington, D.C., that discrepancy is 5 to 7 times. In the UK, Black, Asian, and ethnic minorities, the acronym BAME is used. These make up only 13% of the UK population, but they account for fully 1/3 of COVID patients admitted to critical care. Black Britons are dying of COVID at a rate 71% higher than white Britons. And here in Canada, we see similar forces at work. The CBC recently reported on a correlation study of COVID morbidity and mortality in Montreal, which confirmed what many suspected already, namely that low-income, racially diverse neighborhoods like Montreal Nord have suffered greatly. Well over 220 people have died of COVID in that one neighborhood, and that is more than in the entire province of British Columbia. And a study by scholars at the University of Western Ontario is confirming that these factors are playing themselves out at the country at large. Well, most epidemiologists are probably not surprised by these developments, and dare I say, neither have been many historians of medicine. Epidemics almost always reveal structural inequalities, power imbalances, cultural biases, and historians know this. We've been looking at this for a long time, and it's not polite to say, I told you so, and as Canadians, we know the importance of pretending to be polite. But this is certainly one instance when members of our profession can say that we have seen this kind of thing before. And so we hope that a glimpse at the past can help inform how we understand and confront our present. And on that score, we are very fortunate to have 3 terrific medical historians joining me today in this conversation. I'm going to ask them now to reveal themselves, if they can turn on their cameras, and they can say hello and introduce themselves. Perhaps we can do introductions in the order that we'll be speaking. I'm going to present first because I focus on the earliest period of history. So we're going to move in roughly chronological order, not that it probably matters. So as I've told you, my name is Kevin Siena. I'm from the history department at Trent University. My work has centered on contagious disease in early modern Britain. I've published a fair bit on the history of syphilis and more recently on plague and typhus. And my newest book is called Rotten Bodies, Class and Contagion in 18th Century Britain. After me, and I hope I invite to introduce herself, will be Maureen Lux.
Hi, and thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Assult. I am Maureen Lux. I am currently chair of the history department at Brock University for another 379 days, not that I'm counting. But I come to the topic through my work on racially segregated hospital care for Indigenous people in Canada, particularly First Nations and Inuit. And so I'll be talking today about public health and public health restrictions. And this is from research from my 2016 book, Separate Beds, A History of Indian Hospitals in Canada. So now I think I turn it over to Rich to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Maureen, and thank you, Kevin and Assult, for bringing this together. I am currently a Wellcome Trust Research Fellow at the University of Cambridge in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. I spent many years researching one aspect of the early North American AIDS epidemic, the myth of patient zero. And my current research, so that was finally published in 2017 as the book Patient Zero and the Making of the AIDS Epidemic. And my current research is investigating the processes by which men who had sex with men became a focus of interest to public health workers in the middle decades of the 20th century in North America and England. And now I will pass it over to Karen Flynn.
Thank you. I want to also thank Assult. We went to graduate school together for inviting me to join this wonderful panel, and also to Anya and my fellow panelists. My name is Karen Flynn, and I am the author of Moving Beyond Borders, A History of Black, Canadian, and Caribbean Women in the African Canadian Diaspora, that was published in 2011 by the University of Toronto Press. And I focus on Black, Canadian, and Caribbean nurses. And today I will be talking about COVID-19, and with an emphasis on Black healthcare workers. Thank you.
Okay.
And
Thank you. Well, I'll ask you to come back in a few minutes, and I will drive for a little while. So I'm going to speak about epidemics and the marginalized in the context of 17th century and 18th century England, early modern Britain. So a look at plague in early modern Britain showcases very well how marginalization, specifically in the form of poverty, powerfully framed how diseases were understood, interpreted, and experienced over a very long time. In part, I want to look at how the sufferings of the poor came to be refracted through medical theory and helped lay the groundwork for scientific theories about essential difference in the modern age. And then I would also like to say a few words nearer to the end about how epidemics offer a good chance to gauge whose lives mattered in the early modern period, a function that I would suggest they are continuing to perform today. But we should start by noting that the poor suffered worst during early modern epidemics. Before any discussion of rhetorics or discourses or political strategies, we have to remember this material reality. We know this because we start to get decent demographic record keeping, thanks largely to plague. And as imperfect as these are, things like England's bills of mortality can show us the social scope of 16th and 17th century epidemics. Now, these tended to record deaths by parish, so they're by neighborhood. So we can see at a glance which parts of a city like London suffered the highest mortality, and scholars who have correlated this information with things like tax data can show what any modern epidemiologist would have predicted, namely that impoverished neighborhoods witness much higher mortality than wealthy districts. So wealth in the period influenced quite directly one's ability to strategize during an epidemic, to deal with it. So for example, the ability to flee the city to escape plague, this was contingent upon considerable resources. So a house in the country, a horse and carriage to get there, money to sustain oneself for months away. This also influenced the ability to have servants who would go to the market for you to mitigate your risk, to keep your clothing and your house spick and span. These things all mattered. And so, by contrast, did the crowded living conditions of the urban poor, their prior health when an epidemic struck, and their need to continue working, all of which exacerbated epidemics in their parts of town. So material class distinctions were matters of life and death, and this is to say nothing of the effects of food shortages and unemployment that forever accompanied epidemics, and which of course we're seeing these sorts of economic factors at work today. So contemporaries in the 17th century recorded and therefore knew that plague ravaged the poor. And naturally, they asked the experts to explain why. And when physicians tackled this question, why did plague seem to have a particular thirst for poor bodies? They generated a theory that had profound and long-lasting influence. Doctors argued that the bodies of the poor were physiologically distinct. Specifically, they argued that their blood had a special quality. By living in filth, eating poor quality food, they acquired a kind of putrid or corrupt quality to their blood. And this taint could indeed be inherited from parents to child. This blood would render them, quote unquote, predisposed to acquiring plague when plague hit. This was because plague was believed to be a disease rooted in corruption. So it was born, they thought, in filth and rot, and they thought that it killed by corrupting the body's humors. So by 17th century logic, the bodies that were coursing with blood that was already slightly corrupt, slightly putrid, they would fall prey to the disease more easily. That was the thinking. More worryingly, doctors also argued that the bodies of the poor generated plague. They argued that these corrupt constitutions had the frightening power to intensify the malignity of diseases. So if an ordinary fever found its way into a poor neighborhood, the thinking was that it could descend into plague because it intensified as it went in and out of all of these corrupt bodies. So as it went in and out of all of these paupers' bodies, they thought that it picked up more corruption and therefore became more malignant and indeed could turn into plague. So poor bodies were like little factories that could generate plague. Well, this scientific framing of plebeian physiology had far-reaching implications. First, it offered scientific rationale to sanction socially differentiated policies. One of the most common stipulations in early modern plague orders was the banishing of beggars. So plague orders typically ordered lots of forms of hygiene, cleaning the streets of waste that they thought could spark an epidemic. But now doctors presented the bodies of the poor as themselves a form and source of corruption that could be justifiably driven out of the city under the auspices of public health. It's well known that early modern authorities had a sliding scale when enforcing quarantine. The propertied and respectable could serve quarantine in their homes, while the more dangerous urban poor would be sequestered in a pest house. And London plague orders authorized guards at the city gate to discriminate admission to the city based upon class. Respectable men of note should be admitted, while men of a servile and base condition should not. So medical theories about differentiated physiology supported all of these class-based policing measures. Secondly, it's important to note, to point out how long these theories continued to wield influence. Plague was gone from Britain after the Great London outbreak of 1665 and 6, when 100,000 people died. But Britons didn't know that it wasn't coming back, that was the last of it. So they stayed on guard and they continued to deploy the same basic theory to warn about the congregations of poor bodies well into the 19th century. And this continued belief in the urban poor's unique susceptibility to pathology formed an essential element of 19th century and modern British eugenic discourses, which deployed quasi-racialized depictions of the diseased underclass in their warnings about national degeneration. And the link to race here is also important because scholars like Suman Seth have shown that 18th century theories of alleged racial distinctions in disease susceptibility drew on some of the same theories and language that doctors had hammered out to discuss plague in the poor a century earlier. So there is therefore an important intersectional conversation between early theories of race and early scientific constructions of class, and specifically theories of pathology, theories about contagious disease play a very big role here. But is this history valuable for thinking about today? Well, as I mentioned in my introductory comments, our current crisis is again demonstrating that race and class are commingling to influence COVID morbidity and mortality. And fascinatingly to me, this has led to the same basic phenomenon witnessed in the 17th century, namely that experts are being called upon to explain why. So physicians and epidemiologists and social scientists are all interrogating these demographic discrepancies in COVID outcomes as we speak. So they are asking, for example, whether higher rates of COVID mortality among people of color stem from factors like poverty, access to healthcare, pre-existing health conditions. I've even seen speculation recently on skin color and vitamin D levels in COVID outcomes. They're looking at lots of factors. Or in some cases, they are asking whether the differences that matter are genetic. In an attempt to explain the aforementioned COVID discrepancies among Black, Asian, and ethnic minorities in the UK, researchers at Nottingham University are currently conducting a study of blood samples, quote, to determine whether there is evidence of genetic involvement. That study is not yet complete, but it has already been the subject of some criticism. And the question I will be watching is, whose explanations are going to emerge as authoritative? Will it be those of the sociologists or those of the geneticists? It's way too early to tell, but given the historical track record of scientific theories of essential racial distinctions, this is certainly one question worth watching. I want to make a final point, and that regards the question of whose deaths matter, because early modern epidemics, I think, can be very helpful here. And I'm thinking specifically of 18th century typhus outbreaks, which I've looked at in some detail. Typhus had lots of nicknames in the 18th century. The most common was jail fever, because it was a very common scourge in prisons. There's lots of things fascinating about it. One of the most intriguing is to look at when they spoke about jail fever. When did they proclaim jail fever epidemics? And there's a number of typhus epidemics that can be detected in the 18th century, but these were not when the numbers of prisoners dying of typhus spiked. Prisoners died of typhus all the time, and it caused very little discussion. In that sense, those deaths didn't seem to really matter to contemporaries. However, sometimes typhus spread beyond the prison and struck respectable citizens, notably when judges or lawyers were said to catch fever from prisoners when they entered the courtroom for their trial. This drove panic, and it caused panic, and it drove action, despite that usually only a few people died in these events. So it was not how many people died that mattered, but who died and where. Indeed, contemporary definitions of the terms in the 18th century, epidemic and endemic, can demonstrate the point. An epidemic was not when a disease suddenly struck more people. The term was not defined quantitatively. It was defined qualitatively and geographically. It was when a disease struck different kinds of people or struck in a different place. A disease was epidemic when it had broken out of its natural habitat of the slum or the prison and suddenly appeared in other more respectable places. And that allows us to bring up one final contemporary similarity that deserves comment, because prisons have been one of the real hotspots for COVID in North America. The New York Times reports the sites of the largest COVID clusters, the 100 largest COVID clusters in the United States. Of the top 20, all of which had more than 780 cases linked to them, 14 of 20 were prisons, including the largest 5. Institutions like the Marion Correctional Institution in Marion, Ohio, at last report had over 2,400 confirmed cases linked to it. Yet, we've heard far more about other kinds of places, long-term care homes, for example. We've heard a lot more about them than about prisons. And so the incarcerated can show us one final way how the disenfranchised can suffer terribly during epidemics, but also how in the grand scheme of things, and rather as in the 18th century, it doesn't seem as if their deaths matter. And I'm choosing my words very carefully here, in part because one of the images in one of the articles on COVID in prisoners that I was researching was a photograph of a window at the Cook County Jail in which a prisoner had written to the outside world, quote, "Help, we matter too," end quote. But obviously, the question of whose lives matter is very much in the air the past few weeks. And it is well known that it has been one of the more notorious responses to the claim that Black lives matter has been the often smug retort that all lives matter. And I want to close by saying that the history of epidemics can suggest that that claim is not, historically speaking, accurate. whether in the 17th century or in the 21st century, some lives have counted as mattering more than others. And the history of epidemics is particularly good at showcasing this point. I'm going to wrap up there. That'll be my final comment. And I would now like to invite Maureen to join us and share her thoughts with us.
Hi, thank you, Kevin. I hope I'm broadcasting. I teach in Ontario, but I am currently in Saskatoon, and therefore an uninvited guest on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. The roundtable theme, epidemics and the disenfranchised, has me thinking, of course, how the impacts of epidemics are classed, gendered, racialized, as Kevin astutely pointed out. But I'm also interested in the public health responses that follow that. So, in response to COVID-19, governments declared states of emergency to protect the public health. And these declarations provided legal authority to shut down businesses, some businesses, and generally to restrict our individual rights of movement and association. And people like me, comply with lockdowns because we understand it's in our own best interest. We might grumble about being stuck at home or working from home, but we also understand, that it's important to so-called flatten the curve and that it applies to everybody. But of course it doesn't. It doesn't apply to everybody. The so-called essential workers, healthcare professionals, but also the grocery store clerks, the bus drivers, the cleaners, often poorly paid, often racialized workers, are forced to go to work. They're forced into the teeth of the pandemic, exposing themselves and their families. And we hail them as heroes, but we don't say, because that allows us to, in fact, remain at home and safe. And so that's why they're heroic. Recent events, the Black Lives Matter protests and their supporters in large numbers in the streets have essentially recalibrated the health threat, where police brutality and anti-Black racism are more dangerous, or at least more urgent, than COVID-19. But the unequal nature of emergency lockdowns reminds us how not just epidemics, but public health regulations themselves are classed, gendered, and racialized. And they target the disenfranchised in the interests of the public good, the national health. So I will look at some examples about how tuberculosis and its treatment in the 1940s and 1950s was understood, and in particular, how medical and state discourse characterized tuberculosis in Indigenous communities and the state policies that flowed from that. And I want to argue that public health measures are put to work to protect and maintain white settler privilege, often at the expense of the racialized and disenfranchised. And this is hardly a novel argument, I understand, especially among these esteemed round tablists that are gathered here. So in 1953, the Indian Act, and just to explain, the Indian Act is a comprehensive piece of legislation established in the 19th century that regulates every aspect of First Nations and Inuit lives and is still with us. So in 1953, the Indian Act was amended by the Indian Health Regulations, as they were called. These extra legal regulations were deemed necessary because provincial public health measures were not seen as nearly aggressive enough. So the regulations applied to all Indigenous people, and here I mean First Nations and Inuit, those who lived on reserves, those who did not have reserves, and even those who lived in settler communities. The regulations came in 3 parts, and it gave legal authority to Indian agents to compel medical examination and treatment, and this was covered on in Form 7018, Part A. Part B empowered police to apprehend and detain the ill, usually in hospital, but not necessarily. And Part C empowered the police to arrest and return patients to hospital who had left against medical advice, or as it characterized in the Indian health regulations, those, quote, inmates who had escaped. And of course, these forms were to be completed in triplicate. Violators were also liable to a $100 fine or 3 months in jail or both. So the Indian health regulations made clear the association between Indigenous illness and criminality and incarceration. But why now? Well then, why in 1953? There was no epidemic at the time, and so maybe I'm in the wrong round table here, but I've got the camera and the mic, so I'm going to charge ahead. To understand the context of this amended Indian Act regulations is to examine mid-century intersections in Canada between race, medicine, and the state. So in the years surrounding the Second World War, Canada embraced a system of racially segregated hospital care, the so-called Indian hospitals, and there were 29 of them by 1960. This move by the federal government marked a profound shift in policy. Prior to the 1930s, Indian Affairs accepted very limited responsibility for healthcare. Physicians and bureaucrats characterized Indigenous people as, quote, the dying race. And this allowed state and physicians to ignore the social and economic conditions leading to ill health. But by the 1940s, with Indigenous populations increasing and especially increasingly visible in cities and towns, the medical discourse shifts from the dying race to instead focus on the threat and the danger posed to the national health by Indigenous people. And this was voiced most loudly by the Canadian Tuberculosis Association that represented sanatorium directors and provincial health officials. And what they were doing was pushing the federal government to establish hospitals to protect the nation from what they termed Indian tuberculosis. Because as the sanatorium directors knew full well, Indigenous people were not accepted in their sanatorium. So in 1945, the Indian Health Service was moved from the Department of Indian Affairs to the newly created Department of National Health and Welfare, which was the flagship of the welfare state. And as the minister announced these Indian hospitals, he made clear that the state was undertaking a humanitarian and not a legal obligation, and that these hospitals were necessary for the protection of the rest of the population. So Indian hospitals were rationalized to isolate tuberculosis, but in fact operated as general hospitals, admitting patients based on race, not disease. And the hospitals were established in borrowed buildings, redundant military facilities. They were overcrowded, they were underfunded, they were understaffed. And this stood in sharp contrast to the millions invested annually in provincial hospitals at the same time by the same bureaucracy, National Health and Welfare, through its national health grants, which began in 1948 and added 30 new hospitals per year for 10 years. At the same time, of course, Indian hospitals assured Canadians that they needn't share their new hospitals with Indigenous people. And Indian hospitals with their low civil servant wages ensured that they would never draw qualified staff or resources away from these new community hospitals, with dire consequences for Indigenous people. Given that Indian hospitals' mandate was to protect the national health, coercion characterized their operations. Children in hospital were immobilized by plaster casts on both legs with a bar connecting the casts so they couldn't move. Adults were denied pajamas so they couldn't get out of bed. And of course, there was the Indian health regulations that compelled this hospitalization. Police arrested patients who left hospital and returned them in chains to locked wards. Well after outpatient treatment for tuberculosis had become the norm, Indigenous patients were institutionalized for years and underwent invasive and dangerous chest surgery. The Inuit were relocated to southern institutions for years at a time. Families lost track of their loved ones because the government refused to pay to have the deceased returned home for burial, instead burying patients in unmarked graves in local reserves or nearby cemeteries. And this criminalizing criminalizing ill health, the Indian health regulations codified the fears, real or imagined, of the threat posed by Indigenous people. And of course, this left a disastrous legacy of mistrust in Indigenous communities and continued health disparities, because Indian hospitals treated those who were made ill by reserve poverty only to return the survivors back to the same poverty. So the Indian health regulations, like the COVID-19 lockdown, expose public health regulations' role in marginalizing and harming racialized and disenfranchised communities in order to protect and maintain privilege. Just to conclude, so you know, the current Indian Act, Section 73, subsection H, remains. The minister still has the authority to make regulations to compel hospitalization. Thank you, and now I'll turn things over to Rich.
There we go. Thank you, Maureen. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm representing an institution that is currently evaluating the extent to which it benefited from historical slavery and labor exploitation. And I'm speaking in the United Kingdom, a country that has yet to openly and honestly engage with its history of racist colonialism. Originally, I imagined that my presentation would draw mainly from my work on the North American AIDS epidemic, on historical discourses of blame in epidemic origin narratives, a la Patient Zero, and also from my ongoing research investigating the sexually disenfranchised. This work focuses on men who had sex with men in relation to the mid-20th century control of sexually transmitted infections. In addition, my colleague Erica Charters and I have co-written an introduction to a special issue of the journal Centaurus, out soon, presenting an early set of responses to COVID-19 from historians of science and medicine. I thought I might draw on that too. However, the police murder of George Floyd has profoundly shaken me and this original plan. Amid worldwide anti-racism protests, and especially considering our roundtable's focus on the marginalized and disenfranchised, it no longer felt remotely conscionable to proceed as planned. Instead, I'll start by briefly gesturing to three topics that had previously seemed important. I'll then do what I can as a cisgendered, gay, able-bodied man, raised middle class and racialized as white, to take a small step towards addressing the systemic racism organizing our white-dominated societies. To this end, I believe it is important for me to confront some marginalizations that my own work has exacerbated. I'm aware that by proceeding in this way, I risk reinscribing racism by making this conversation about me and my experience. As a counterbalance, I will conclude with reference to research by Kathy Cohen, a Black, feminist, lesbian scholar whose intersectional work on politics, marginalization, and HIV deserves continued wide readership. Briefly, then, here are 3 topics that we might explore further during discussion. First, perhaps unsurprisingly, the current pandemic has seen a widespread resurgence of patient zero stories. I've written a lot about this, so perhaps you'll allow me to summarize with 2 words: clickbait. Second, I've been pondering how disproportionately distributed epidemic burdens, often fueled by systemic discrimination, might sometimes generate creative solutions and transformative political interventions. For example, demands that gay men be sexually abstinent in the early AIDS epidemic helped spur the repurposing of the condom as a queer safe-sex technology. We might also compare silence equals death, the battle cry adopted by ACT UP activists in 1987, with recent shouts of "I can't breathe." As the Nigerian poet Ben Okri noted, the consonance of the phrase with the very root of our pandemic fears is uncanny. The phrase linked the coronavirus with the ubiquitous and implacable nature of institutional racism. Third, it has been deeply unsettling to witness the British government's dysfunctional response to COVID-19. Among many horrors, a technological triumphalism that boosts solutions like contact tracing apps without working to safeguard public trust. In my own research, a recurrent theme is the effort required from some public health authorities to reassure members of gay communities that personal information collected in the course of contact tracing would remain confidential and not be shared with police. Public health needs public trust from all the overlapping constituent communities making up the public. Let me now explain how I've begun reflecting on how my own work has contributed to and reinforced a process of marginalization. Initially buffered by the inertia of privilege, I had followed but not deeply engaged with news of the Black Lives Matter protests for several years. Then, in early 2019, I read Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility. Completely transformative, DiAngelo's book provided me with a previously missing language and analytic framework, filling important gaps in my understanding and ability to conceptualize race and systemic racism. In small ways, I'd begun practicing her suggestions, speaking more about race and reading more works by authors of color. However, watching Darnella Fraser's bystander video capturing Floyd's death produced in me such overwhelming revulsion that I felt jolted into action. A previously slow, gradual growth in racial self-awareness rapidly accelerated. Since then, I've consumed more books, films, podcasts, and Twitter threads specifically about race and racism than ever before. Work by critical race scholars, filmmakers, and journalists like DiAngelo, Ibram X. Kendi, Rennie Edo-Lodge, Ava DuVernay, Gary Young, and Angela Saini, among others. The more I learn, the more I realize there is to learn. As many of you will know, DiAngelo's suggestions for white people attempting to address systemic racism include minimizing our defensiveness, demonstrating our own vulnerability, curiosity, and humility, practicing what we profess to value, interrupting privilege protecting comfort, and breaking the silence to discuss race and racism with other white people. Although we likely have a racially diverse audience today, the tendency for universities to reproduce overwhelmingly white spaces leads me to treat this as an opportunity to practice some of DiAngelo's recommendations. Right now, I'm feeling distinctly uncomfortable and vulnerable, highlighting my own work's limitations in front of a remote Zoom audience, many of whom are strangers. Perhaps, then, I'm doing at least some of this correctly. In a 2017 podcast exploring sexuality and racism, DiAngelo explained how white queer people, with their lifetimes of swimming against the dominant currents of heterosexism and androcentrism, have an incredible way in to understanding structural racism. The key is, she added, not to use it as a way out. DiAngelo elaborated, our task is to use our intersections to figure out how they may have set us up to collude with someone else's oppression. It's deeply uncomfortable to think that my historical work on Patient Zero has contributed to the erasure of the experiences of people of color, and yet increasingly I can see that this is so. By moving from my own experiences of marginalization as a white gay man, and frequently failing to explore much further, I missed opportunities to move into a deeper intersectional analysis. I did not foreground race as an analytical category in my past writing. This is a significant shortcoming. I wrote a history featuring Gaetan Dugas, a white gay man. I stayed very close to that experience, but lacked the racial self-awareness, analytical confidence, and ability to foreground race and especially whiteness. For too long, I now realize I thought that race was an analytic tool best deployed to understand the experiences of people of color, especially in instances of interpersonal discrimination, without appreciating its broader importance for tracing flows of power and their cumulative structural impacts on health. By not foregrounding race, I remained very close to Gaetan Dugas and to Randy Shilts, the white gay journalist who wrote the influential history And the Band Played On. Too close, too often without asking how their experiences might have differed from those not racialized as white. Perhaps, I thought initially, this was justifiable in relation to Dugas and the classic 1982 cluster study, which investigated a sexual network of 40 early AIDS cases among gay men, where almost all of these individuals were white. And yet, had I looked closer, seeing what I now see, I would have noticed that nearly 1/3 of the total reported AIDS cases at that time, whom the Centers for Disease Control classified as homosexual, were not white. What were their experiences? How might these have differed from Dugas? And how did Dugas' whiteness function in terms of granting him better access, for example, to employment, transnational mobility, healthcare, and insurance? How did Dugas' whiteness function after his death, when his became an internationally broadcast representative face of the epidemic, precisely when AIDS was shifting to overwhelmingly affect communities of color? To what extent did the media's focus on Dugas' white body occur at the expense and visibility of Black, Indigenous, and people of color grappling with AIDS? In retrospect, I'm seeing the consequences of the paths that I followed and regret that I lacked the awareness and ability to adequately signal to readers the routes not taken at these intersections. I also regret that my impaired ability to make these deeper connections delayed my encounter with the vital scholarship of Kathy Cohen, who examined the AIDS epidemic unfolding in African-American communities from 1981 to the late 1990s, a period broadly overlapping with my own book. For those who haven't yet read The Boundaries of Blackness, I recommend it heartily, not only for Cohen's careful, unflinching examination of the ways that AIDS represented a crisis and largely missed opportunity for leaders in American Black communities, but also with relevance for this conversation, for her dynamic, historically minded, and multi-layered theory of marginalization. Cohen emphasizes the need to consider differing patterns of marginalization, categorical, integrative, advanced, and secondary, and when thinking of marginalized groups, attending to their identities and norms, ideologies, Indigenous institutions, and social relationships. Her model for thinking about marginalization encourages a focus on cross-cutting issues, constraints on power, counterflows of resistance, and change over time. Cohen's words from 1999 still ring powerfully true. The real work of marginalization, she wrote, happens systematically through the daily actions of individuals, many of whom seem to be nice people who are simply doing their jobs and have no obvious plan to actively participate in the exclusion of certain groups. Thus, we should be clear that intent or malice is not a necessary condition for marginalization to occur. If we agree with Cohen and D'Angelo when they say that neither intent nor malice are necessary for marginalization and systemic racism to function, then I would encourage other white scholars to join me in directing our critical gaze at our own work. We might not initially like what we see, but doing so will help to lay the foundations for more honest, equitable, and meaningful interventions in the future and about the past. Thank you. And I'll now pass the baton to our final speaker, Karen Flynn.
Thanks, Rich. My presentation today is titled, We're Here to Help Someone Who Need Our Help, Black Healthcare Workers and COVID-19. Once COVID-19 reached pandemic proportions, like so many people around the world, I was glued to my television screen, completely bewildered by this disease that were taking so many lives and to which public health experts in the initial stages had very few answers. At nights, I stayed up late reading COVID stories and clicking on the globe my sister Shauna sent me. With just a touch, I had access to quantitative data on COVID cases globally. As I settled into the quote unquote new normal, I began waiting, and I'm still waiting to see where Black healthcare professionals fit within this larger discourse of essential workers in Canada as well as the United States. In the Canadian context, I was struck by how Black healthcare workers entered this discourse of essential workers as victims, raceless dead heroes whose lives were taken by the pandemic, dying doing the jobs they love. I'm referring to personal support workers, Arlene Reed, Leonard Rodriguez, and Sharon Roberts, all died in April and May respectively after contracting COVID-19. And I also chose to include Marlene, the other woman of color who died as well in May. So much of this reminds me of poet Claudia Rankine's point that, quote, the condition of Black life is one of mourning, unquote. While I recognize the deep loss and grief experienced by family members, friends, and colleagues, I want to challenge the current representation of Ontario Black healthcare workers in COVID discussions. In this preliminary paper, which I'm still thinking about, I draw on interviews with Black healthcare professionals, underscoring their fears, hopes, and aspirations, providing a window into the racialized and gender dimensions of healthcare labor. And before I proceed, I want to acknowledge the fact that the term PSW, professional support workers, people often refer to them as unregulated care providers who provide assistance with personal and supportive care. However, in 2010, the Ontario Ministry of Health and Long-Term Care has required that personal support workers complete a PSW program. From the onset, I want to underscore that contemporary discussions about pandemics and health inequality cannot be divorced from how historically Black people have been situated within the Canadian nation. Whether from the Caribbean or the United States, Black people were hardly considered legitimate nation builders. At the beginning of the 20th century, immigration officials, self-appointed steward of Canada's racial purity, circulated racist and sexist discourses of Caribbean people as lazy, sexually promiscuous, mentally and morally deficient, and therefore unfit to migrate. But as I've repeatedly argued in my work, labor demands has a way of tempering racist immigration policies. Thus, despite objections from Immigration Canada, the Dominion Iron and Steel Company, known as VISCO, located in Sydney, Nova Scotia, recruited 61 laborers from the Caribbean to work in the mines during 1920 to 1921. All immigrants who came to Sydney to work for VISCO lived on the land owned by the company. According to Jennifer Reed, Caribbean migrants live in a segregated area, the loudest and most toxic due to its proximity to the tar plant and coke ovens that filled the air with clouds of pollutants. Community elder Beryl Brathwaite, a resident of Whitney Pier, pointed out how the community's location had serious health implications, such as the prevalence of fatal lung diseases, including tuberculosis, pneumonia, and pleurisy. Canada's need for healthcare workers, especially nurses, led to their migration following the Second World War. In 1958, some nursing directors reported that, quote, a large portion of Haitian girls who are nursing aides have proven themselves unsuitable and unreliable, unquote. Haitian nurses were also described as, quote, lazy, negligent, and also lacking in hygiene, unquote. Regardless of these gendered and racist representations of Haitian nurses working at the lowest echelons of the nursing hierarchy, they and their English-speaking Caribbean counterparts rather filled an important niche very similar to what we see in terms of the PSWs, who are in demand for an aging population. Referring to the makeup of our union, who lost the three women of color mentioned, pointed out in the slides earlier, Jamaican-born Gloria Turney, a 50-year-old PSW, pointed out that it's primarily Black and Filipino nurses that comprise Black and Filipina PSWs rather, that comprise the membership of the Services Employees International Union, to which her close friend Audrey Reed was also a member. Like the Black nurses I interviewed in my book, Moving Beyond Borders, these interviews exhibited an ethic of care that underpins their labor. These healthcare professionals not only worried about themselves, about their own family members, but their patients and their family members, colleagues, and co-workers. Gloria currently works at a long-term care facility as well as an institution. Initially, as well as another institution. Initially, she thought about resigning from the former, but decided against it. She explained, quote, I thought, what are you running away from? You could go out in the street and have an accident. For some of my clients, I'm the only person they're used to seeing, unquote. For Gloria, it's the client, not the wages. She added that she makes $19.13 an hour before taxes, and that PSWs were supposed to earn an additional $4 from the government, which is temporary. Instead of working, Gloria pointed out that she could have collected the CERB, Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, and employment insurance. She emphasized again, quote, it is not for the money. We're not well paid, definitely not for the money, unquote. To further illustrate, she added, quote, I sat on the bargaining committee for my union. We got 33 cents raise for the next 3 years. This is not a glamorous job. We do it because we're compassionate, unquote. Gloria interviews speaks to the complicated dimensions of Black women's lives. She's fully cognizant of the composition of her union, her low-paid wages, and the unglamorous nature of her job. Another healthcare worker, Dawn Layler, who's also 33, also Jamaican-born, is currently pursuing her bachelor's in nursing. She too is currently working full-time as an RPN, working with dialysis patients. Dawn also worked a second job as a casual worker to pay her school fees and to make ends meet. Dawn was also worked 8 years as a PSW. That Black women and women of color are concentrated in sectors of the labor force associated with low income impacts their standard of living, which has implications for their health, an issue that due to time constraints, I will be unable to address. The youngest nurse in her 30s, Charlene, is a pediatric nurse in Ottawa and has been working at our institution for 3 years. While she's situated differently in the healthcare hierarchy than, for example, Dawn and Gloria, her analysis of her labor reveals the inner workings of nursing culture, but also her own individual response to working during COVID-19. Even as she recognizes that it's a pandemic and the possibility that nurses will contract COVID-19, Charlene worries constantly about the possibility of contracting the virus and the impact on social relationships between her colleagues and management. She explains, quote, if I get sick, I will miss another round of work. There's a nursing culture. You don't call in, you go into work, you suck it up, and you come into work. What if I break the unwritten rules, she asked. Again, she also emphasized, it is not the money. She added, quote, you work because you're needed. I love the job. I get paid if I miss work, unquote. Her response is to stay vigilantly healthy. As with medicine, the institutions that Black healthcare workers work in and for perpetuate structural inequalities that is hierarchical and is asymmetrical, reinforcing gendered racism. One ER nurse mentioned how she prefers to work in the ER as a screening nurse because it protects her from being overburdened with COVID patients. According to this nurse, quote, I don't do a lot of personal care. However, if I'm working on the unit, I would be assigned all the COVID patients to limit the PPE, unquote. Another nurse, when asked about being interviewed, responded with, quote, I have nothing to say except that COVID patients are assigned to Black nurses, unquote. Hope Magnus, the eldest of the interviews, 70 years old, works as an administrator on site. She works to ensure that nurses are treated equitably and encourages a climate where nurses are able to report if they feel the distribution of labor in relation to COVID patients is unfair. She, however, pointed out that senior Black nurses complained to the union about being asked to work in long-term care facilities. As with healthcare professionals in general, Black healthcare workers are struggling emotionally and psychologically with the impact of COVID-19. They mention patients dying alone, families unable to see their relatives, and the impact on their own families. Helen pointed out, quote, I can't get to hug my son. I don't get to go to my mom's house for dinner, unquote. Gloria's son currently lives with his girlfriend. Jackie Thompson, born and raised in Ottawa, currently a respiratory therapist, raises the issue of COVID-19's impact on Black communities in the US and the UK, pointing out that they're disproportionately impacted by the disease in comparison to other ethnicities. According to Jackie, quote, being a Black female with a history of asthma put me at a relatively higher risk of complications compared to someone of a different race ethnicity without an underlying lung pathology, unquote. Unlike the US and Britain, Canada has lagged behind, despite empirical evidence that demographic information is also critical to addressing health inequalities. COVID-19 has resulted in renewed efforts for the Canadian government to collect race-based data. At present, the anecdotal evidence overwhelmingly suggests that in geographical areas such as Toronto and Montreal, that Black people are one of the groups disproportionately impacted. Indeed, as you see from the slide, 4 people of color, 3 women, and 1 male PSWs have died from contracting COVID-19. In conclusion, the voices and perspectives of Black healthcare professionals are key to discussions of pandemic narratives, one that recognizes the specificity of their experiences in the here and now, as opposed to a memorialization of their deaths in the hereafter. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you all. And maybe if I can ask Maureen as well to get your camera on, and we can have a chat. I don't see any questions yet, so I can put out to the audience. If you've got questions or comments, please do send them by the chat. I might just maybe while we wait, make a quick reflection that I was thinking about while Karen was just speaking, and that is about this issue of labor, about this issue of work, because when one of the first things I wrote when COVID hit was an op-ed piece, and for whatever reason, all of us as historians, we were confronting, the news as it was unfolding and thinking about what we already knew about and what we already studied. And one of the first examples that I thought about was a weird figure in early modern Britain called the Searchers of the Dead. So very briefly, when plague hit, one of the most important questions that they had to answer was when somebody died, was it a plague death or was it just somebody had a heart attack, or people die of all kinds of things. Because if it is a plague death, then they need, all of the mechanisms of quarantine have to kick into gear. So they needed people to go into these homes to look at dead bodies and report on whether or not the person died of plague. So that is almost the most important piece of information. Did they get physicians to do this? No, they sent old, poor women who they called the searchers of the dead. Basically, these were pensioners, and they basically threatened them with losing their parish pension if they didn't take on this work. So one of the most important and dangerous jobs fell to people who we would say were at the margins because of gender and because of class and also because of age. They tended to be elderly. And so I wrote an op-ed piece on this, and it came out right when the other thing that sort of blew my mind at the start of COVID was, Trudeau closed the border with the United States, which in itself is a kind of a stunning historical development. Like, oh my God, the border with the United States is closed. And within about 48 hours, they were making exceptions for migrant agricultural workers. The farmer said, well, wait a second, if we don't have these laborers from the global south, we're not going to get a crop in. And all of a sudden, this incredibly far-reaching historic policy to close the border, there was an exception to allow migrant workers to come in. And now, perhaps predictably, some of these people have been dying. I mean, there was a report last week of several migrant workers from Mexico who have passed away. And so, I guess this leads to this sort of question about, who does the work, and whose work is valued, and whose work is opening people up to different levels of risk. I mean, we're all trying to manage and even conceptualize risk. How dangerous is it to go to the grocery store and all of the rest? But as you started to suggest, everybody's not facing the same risk. Some people who can work from home, and I'm just sort of throwing that out there. Do you have a comment? I'll sort of read. We're now getting some questions. I'll sort of read. Does any of this spark anything for you, Karen?
Most definitely. So going back to my work on Black Canadian and Caribbean nurses in the first book, I know that a consistent concern of those nurses, and keep in mind they were RNs, they were not nurses aides or even PSWs, or just, they weren't on the lower echelons, obviously, but that was for them, that was a concern about being given sort of more patients, heavier patients, sort of later shifts, or there were questions around the holidays that they were, right? So they would work on holidays such as Christmas, while white nurses were given sort of more, less patients, would get those holidays off. But that's kind of the way in which I think that's what gendered racism operates in terms of sort of this medical hierarchy, in that it places different groups of nurses, racialized nurses in particular areas in the occupation itself. And we see that now, 20 years later, 30 years later, nurses, whether or not nurses, RPNs and nurses, still sort of having the same kinds of concerns. And those are RNs. And of course, with PSWs, they're doing sort of this unregulated labor, low income labor, and most of them are also in long-term care facilities as well.
And it's just worth pointing out as well that there's been a campaign to raise the minimum wage in Canada to $15 an hour for a very long time, and there's been a very strenuous campaign against that. And I think I just read this weekend that they had given, some of the large grocery chains in Canada had given a $2 an hour raise to grocery store workers. And now that we've moved to phase 2 of reopening, that's going the way of the dodo bird. So you know, the applause of these essential workers, you know, is maybe dying out a little bit as people settle into this this epidemic for the long haul. Okay, we've got some. I'm going to try to do double duty here. Someone's asked, some of you seem to rely more on data and some on narrative. Do you agree on the best way to focus as researchers, or is there a methodological difference? So I think the crux of that is asking maybe about the extent to which we're drawing on numbers, you know, data, information that is crunched in numbers, and information that is you know, coming at us in words, in narratives. Do any of you like to think about how you deal with different kinds of evidence in that way?
I'll take a stab. I was thinking when I was reading the question that in some ways it's all data, whether it's numbers, whether it's words. When I look at the breadth of historical work that gets carried out, you almost see as many approaches as there are historians, and that we are a very broad church in terms of the methods that people will rely on. I think I'm personally more drawn to words, but I also think it depends on what the period is and what the available evidence is. And sometimes you will have an abundance of one form and a complete lack of the other, or so the correct tool for the job, maybe, and depends on the job. That's my first attempt to answer that.
I might answer that as well, or speak about that, as well as address Mary Jane McCallum's question in the chat about, you know, Kevin talked about the concept of blood being corrupted and generating disease, and so her question is, did physicians believe that there was something different, that there was an Indian tuberculosis that was somehow different than you know, what settler Canadians suffered from? And I mean, that's an interesting question, and I think it changes over time. Especially, I think once there were beds available, whether in Indian hospitals or as the sanatoriums emptied because of outpatient treatment, beds were available in those now, you know, the miracle of the empty beds in those empty sanatoria. And at that point, I think physicians began to say, oh no, it's the same disease for Indigenous people, and the same measures need to be taken. That is long terms of institutionalization and isolation. Even though the reason there could be long stretches of institutionalization was because treatment had changed. It had changed to antibiotic or antimicrobial treatment for settler communities. But while Indigenous people were institutionalized for oftentimes years at a time, they also underwent antimicrobial drug treatment and chest surgeries. So, you know, had tuberculosis, was it seen as different in Indigenous communities and settler communities? I think that over time that changes. And initially I think it was, and then as treatment became possible and the kind of treatment that physicians wanted, that is institutionalized treatment, then it was very much characterized as the same kind of disease. I hope that answers your question, Mary Jane.
Yeah, and I would just follow up on that and say that when I was researching my book, it really pointed out to me the role of disease pathology, theories about disease, in the larger sciences of constructing what scholars in the 18th century called the science of human variety. As you start to get this discussions of difference based in various sciences, that there are lots of ways that people are being categorized, and skin color is just one of them. And there is this persistently present is a debate about disease and whether people respond to diseases differently. In the 18th century, there's debates about whether people of African descent might be immune to yellow fever. These sort of things are there. And I'm thinking of Rana Hogarth and Suman Seth's work on race, but also Daniel Bender's done good work on immigrant Jews in early 20th century New York, and Sarah Isabel Wallace discussing Asian Canadians in turn of the century BC. So there actually is a really long history of contagious disease being deployed as one way of feeling out whether we can categorize people into these groups. And it's really impossible to say we're in the early days of COVID. Like, a lot of people think that we've been in this for a long time. It certainly feels like that, but there are, in many ways, these are really early days. This play has many acts yet to come, and it's hard to say where it's going. And I'm of two minds, because of course, when I was presenting, I'm saying, like, there are studies already trying to look for a genetic component that might matter here. And at the same time, the disease seemed to go around the world so quickly and affect people in every part of the globe so quickly that it may have had the effect to mute a little bit the sense that it's impacting people differently. I don't know. We do have a question, though, that I want to get to that sort of maybe touches on this or can grow out of this discussion, and that is Tara Abraham's question. The issue of the bill's mortality make me think about statistics and recording of COVID-19 deaths and cases. And she asks, how quickly did information about race, gender, and class factor into record keeping for COVID? And I know that Karen made reference that in Canada, there's debate about the fact that race wasn't being recorded. And then that of course raises the issue of, well, if you're recording things like race and ethnicity, on the one hand, it's almost like you're codifying it. But on the other hand, if you don't record it, then you don't have the data, to go back to the question about data and kinds of data that you have. So, it's very thorny. But where are we? Am I right that they are now starting to record ethnicity and race?
Well, I think that there's been some push, and I believe I saw on Twitter that yes, there's going to be attempts to be able to do it, but it also seems quite fragmented to me anyway. How this is going to go about, because I do believe that there are some studies around health inequality that have attempted to address sort of health inequalities in terms of looking at questions of demographic questions, but it's very, very, very fragmented at this juncture. But I think it would help with the data. And what struck me was looking at, when I started doing some research about the deaths of the PSWs, I noticed for the most part, no one mentioned sort of their gender or their race. They were just, these PSWs who passed away. And I found that quite interesting, but that would be Canada for us. Sometimes, we operate as a raceless nation.
Right.
I just watched a presentation would have been about a month ago. It was recorded with Nancy Krieger from Harvard, talking about the really variable nature of this, of racial information being recorded in the different data sources that are used in the United States, and researchers having to attempt to use proxy measures to kind of postcode and demographic components of makeup of a neighborhood to try and get some sense. So it'll be interesting to see whether there is an increased push to make it part of, widespread standardized reporting.
Mm-hmm. And if I can make one point, going back to the question about data versus narrative, the different kinds of evidence, Rich said, well, words are data, it's all data. And then the converse is also true, that, numbers are a form of rhetoric in a way, or at least oftentimes they can act. So it stands in for a kind of certainty, but actually once you start digging into where numbers come from and how numbers are produced, then it can have this function. I've gotten the high sign that we should try to wrap up in the next few minutes. I might throw out one question that I was thinking of, and that is, to some extent, epidemics can act as the way historians use epidemics, the way historians look at epidemics is they can provide windows to show you what a society is made of at a given time. They're a sort of a window in, so they expose structural inequalities and this kind of thing. But epidemics might also themselves be sort of drivers of change. So to what extent do epidemics show us social, political forces that exist, and to what extent do they change them? And I'll throw that out for you to think about, both in terms of the historical examples that you study, and also to talk about the moment we're in. Is this a transformative moment, or a year from now, is it going to be like, you remember that time we were all locked in? Oh yeah, that was so weird. To what extent is this driving change?
I wish that the Centaurus issue that I mentioned in my piece, where Erica Charters and I co-wrote the introduction, but she guest edited, did the contributions from about a dozen historians looking at different periods. As we crafted the opening, the introduction, trying to think about histories of epidemics, I mean, uncertainty I think that was one of the keywords we used for the overall article, was uncertainty, how to manage it. We talked about how numbers, the way that they're used almost deceptively as kind of like, we're following this in real time, the recorded numbers, recorded deaths and infections. And yet we also know through our work and through looking at the news, how constructed those number counts can be, and how there can be lots of missing information. So yeah, numbers can take in the media and narrative pull and draw of their own, which governments can then use as a justification for certain bold measures. And I guess one other thing would be thinking about, epidemics. We're often tempted to think that epidemics, in the absence of an epidemic, you have no disease, but actually you have endemic disease, all of these kind of things that are generally accepted. So with the shutdown, for example, in London, there's reports that air quality has gotten so much better that people who were otherwise languishing with lung conditions and breathing difficulties are so much better, but those conditions were hidden before. So regarding what Kevin said, I think there's this combination of epidemics can be a spotlight in the way that a society will realize that things aren't agreed, and there's that things are up for grabs, really, in terms of what, whose lives matter and whose health matters, and where should health be, and whose bodies in what locations, etc. Mm-hmm. Pass that over now.
Others want to take a stab at it?
I'm,
Yeah, Karen.
yeah, for me, there's just so much happening right now, both in the US and Canada around, the pandemic, but also around, policing and police brutality. And my hope is that both these phenomenons simultaneously will push people, but also institutions and our government to rethink policies around, policing and ideas about health and healthcare. In the Canadian context, I think that it is so easy for us to, even though I'm currently in the US, to point to the United States as this place where, racism is happening and police brutality is happening, without ignoring, the relationship of the RCMP to First Nations communities, to Black communities as well. Like, I think that it's important to look in our own backyard. I think someone asked about that on the chat. What do we move going forward? And I think as Canadians, we have to move beyond this idea of, and even in the British context too, sort of this denial around how structural inequalities operate and who it impacts. Because I remember reading somewhere where around the collecting race-based, ethnic-based data, and one of our government officials says, "Oh, we're all equal," or there's no difference, right? That kind of that sort of framework is really, really problematic. So I'm hoping for transformation on multiple levels.
Well, maybe this is a good place to stop. It's gone to 3:30, so we've been over 90 minutes. This has been really fantastic. Historians aren't necessarily the best people to be predicting the future, but I've heard it said that we're really good at asking the right questions, and I think I hope that this has given a lot for people to chew on. This has been recorded, and so it will be available. I believe that it will be available first on the Canadian Society for the History of Medicine Facebook page, and I think we're going to find a more permanent home for it. So thank you to everyone who's tuned in, and thanks for all of the questions, and sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Thank you very much to my co-panelists for this stimulating discussion. Stay safe and well, and take good care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Well, that was fun. I hope. Yeah, you gave a lot of thought to this, Rich. I was
here.
What's that?
So it's is it the four of us now?
I think.
and a canine?
Actually, it's still, anyone who's still on is still there. So, so I can only just end it for everybody.
Right.
Right. You did a wonderful job.
Oh, I didn't know there was a date for the vaccination one to announce it. Sorry, that's great.
Sorry, I should have. Yeah, I sent it to Anya. That's good though. It always comes kind of at a rush at the end. People are sort of start to kind of drift off a little bit just because they've got other commitments and stuff too. So yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Okay. Well, thanks, Hazel. I hope it was, I hope it worked. And let me know if when it's sort of ready to be up. Like when is the other one up and available for public consumption?
Yeah,
the flu one?
On the CSHM website, I think it's under events or something.
Okay.
So originally, you get a kind of a temporary available file that you can link to, And then if you want it to be available permanently, you need to download it and put it on YouTube. So the CSHM people, I think, have got that all nailed down now. So we should be able to have a permanent visual or permanent recording up on the CSHM website for as long as we want it to be there. So yeah, people will be able to view it there.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm gonna go breathe and relax.
Yeah, me too. Thanks for pulling that together, guys. And Assult, I realize it's been years since I've seen you like face to face, so it's nice to.
I can't remember when it was. It was a while ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
I really wanted to come to Europe this fall, but I don't, because I'm on sabbatical in July, and I wanted to come. I was going to go to Swansea to see Michael, and I was to Edinburgh, but I don't know whether either of those things are going to happen now.
I know. It's back to that keyword, uncertainty.
Yes, very much, very much. Okay, take care.
Yeah, take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.